Hello, protocols, packets, and programs. Welcome to October, when tales of terror become timely and horror marks our days to Halloween. And what can be scarier than a breach notification? Here at Camp Crystal Lake, we take security seriously. On Friday the 13th, we identified adversarial activity that leveraged credentialed access to our counselors in training. The threat actor was able to view several counselors in extracurricular activities. It should be noted that this only affected the camp reopening process. The actor accessed some camp equipment and used it in an unauthorized manner. Our investigation that indicated one canoe was set adrift in the lake. It has been recovered. Which means this week we chat with Dan Kuykendall about the necessary evolution of security tools and the importance of dev leadership. In the news segment, mishandling OAuth tokens, maturing DevOps poisoning AI, sandboxing services, and more. Grab a flashlight and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals.
It's the show to learn the latest tools and techniques to understand DevOps, applications, and the cloud. Your trusted source for the latest AppSec news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. AI, accelerated cloud adoption, and hybrid work are fundamentally shifting how business gets done. The old way of securing your people, apps, and data doesn't work and scale anymore. To stay ahead, today's organizations need to reimagine their security and networking infrastructure with a cloud-first, unified SASE architecture. Join Palo Alto Networks and leading technologists from across the globe for SASE Converge 2023, a two-day virtual experience, November 15th through 16th, revealing how SASE, powered by advanced AI, can drive better security and networking outcomes. Register today at securityweekly.com/Palo Alto. This is episode 261, recorded October 30th, almost Halloween 2023. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with John the Killer Kinsella.
You know, Mike, it's
Hello,
it's
John.
that time of year. The fall colors are starting to change. Things are getting colder, at least here in the northern hemisphere. You know, we're starting to see a little bit of like the holidays come around, a little bit of spices and different foods coming out. So I think the one thing I have for you that's scarier than a breach notification, pumpkin spice application security.
Oh, no. Yeah, we don't even need the top 10 spices for application security. You just topped it off right there. So in addition to celebrating pumpkin spice application security, we are also celebrating the milestone of reaching over 1,000 members of our CISO community. The Cybersecurity Collaboration Forum is a one-stop shop for executive collaboration comprised of CISOs across various industries. If you want to be part of this growing community of CISOs, join us as a member or technology partner. Learn more at securityweekly.com/cybersecurity collaboration. Dan is an industry leader in application security for over 20 years, with a total of 30 years in tech. He's the former co-founder and CEO of NT Objectives and senior director of application security products at Rapid7. He currently works on advising startup leaders and teaching software development leadership. He also hosts the Dan on Dev YouTube channel. Hello, Dan. Thank you for joining us.
Fantastic to be here. It's good to see you again.
It is good to see you.
And new ones here.
Old faces and new faces, yes, because we were together at that 20 years ago or so at NT Objectives doing some DAST, doing some scanning. And speaking of scary things, Dan, I've been following you this summer, and you embrace some clickbait. I'm kind of worried here. Everything sucks. These things sucks. I need you to tell me why. Why have you gone to clickbait and the scary side, Dan? What was the background of that series?
Yeah, so we'll touch on one thing real quick. We actually worked at Foundstone together also.
Indeed.
Forgot about that one there. Okay, so I had originally done this as a conference talk, and when you're doing conference talks, you're always having to try to get when they're looking at the roster of talks to go to and which track they want to go into, got to be a little clickbaity. And so the idea here was I was just going to go over why all of the different categories of products, like the strengths and weaknesses. Mm-hmm. So obviously the weaknesses stood out as a good way to clickbait the title, right? And so while it's titled, why all AppSec products suck, and I go through each category, it's really about the strengths and weaknesses of each of the product categories, really to guide the viewer or the audience to understand which tools would do what things and what things well, so that you ideally could pick the right tools for the job, right? And that's really the guidance through the whole conversation.
So a nuanced discussion, that's possibly even scarier in the world of AppSec. I don't believe it. But Dan, it's funny. I like that you brought that up because as I mentioned, we were building a web scanner, 20 plus years ago. And I've come around to be like, at least the web scanner that we were building at the time probably wouldn't use. I've come around to figuring out where to weigh that, how to recommend like a DAS scanner, even a SAS for that matter, which I think gets to some of what you're talking about. So tell us a little bit why, all these solutions suck, or perhaps what they would look like if they were better today.
Yeah, if I want to have a universal why they suck, is because generally the vendors overstate what they were actually able to do.
Yeah, your marketing sucks. The tool doesn't necessarily.
Yes. Yeah. And then I would say a lot of the tools, across the board, keeping up with the pace of changes to how people build applications, they all struggle. They're all going to struggle. They're all going to have major challenges with the evolution of dev models. And so that's probably the biggest challenge. And so then it's about how are you building your things, and which tools are going to be suitable for how you're still doing things, right?
And this is things like, the single page app, to be real easy, I'm going to say, is an easy example, or just APIs. And maybe not all APIs have easy Swagger documentation, because if you have Swagger, you can crawl it, you can understand how to manipulate it. If you don't, good luck building up that state machine to figure it out.
Yeah, if let's say a DAS scanner in that case, it has been updated to handle the data formats and can interpret the Swagger docs, the Open API docs well enough, and know how to either read the examples in there when they're provided, which is still pretty rare, but be able to understand the examples or is good at figuring out what data types should go into each field so that you can get a good request, right? So then how bad is working. If you don't have a baseline, testing is very difficult. So DAS can do well. Going to the single page apps, now it's all about the crawler. How well can they crawl the DOM and interpret all the variations without going down the infinite crawling problem that we used to solve? I remember we'd have like the web calendar where it was like, you could hit next day forever. And so we had to learn how to like understand, okay, these are a set of parameters. I'm only going to do a certain number of variations. That was kind of easy when there were get parameters. But when it's a DOM that's getting changed, and understanding that you can also have an infinite crawling essentially on a DOM, how do you know when to stop? And then once you go down a path, how do you know, like, the DOM is forever changed, so how do you get back to where you came from? And how do you understand the state machine of that application? Is it storing in view, like in the, is it a cookie? So it's server side? Is it in local storage? Where is it handling the state management? All this becomes enormously difficult because every application is different, right? And even if they're using a given framework, they could still do certain parts of it custom, and they just make a mess of things for a tester, right? I mean, they're producing the product they want to produce, but for a scanner, for an automated tool trying to interpret all this, what a mess. Very difficult.
It's messy. And, we had the luxury at the beginning too. There was only I'm traumatized by this still, I believe. There was only one version of the OWASP top 10 at the time, let alone only one top test topic. But, now we have SAST and DAST, and I mentioned you've been advising, talking with startups. Do these categories still make sense? Should we still be talking about SAST, DAST, or what are you seeing on the good evolution of tools, or the tools that you would like to deploy and use today for modern apps?
Yeah. So I still think you need a collection. And I've been, what's fun with doing the advisory work for these investment funds is getting to talk to some of these founders of new companies that are trying to come at these problems in different ways. So, I've talked to the folks. I actually did a webinar or something with the guys from Blast, BLST. They do API scanning. They kind of do a mix of static to discover the Swagger Open API docs that kind of like can auto-generate out of code in a lot of cases, and then start testing, and they can monitor kind of some of the functions. So that's kind of interesting. I don't think they're DAST, they won't like me saying this, but they like, I'm like, oh, what about the web app portion? And they're like, oh yeah, we have a crawler too. And I'm like, no, a crawler is not something you also have. A crawler is its own beast that took me, I remember our team, I spent 20 years building crawlers and refining and tweaking and dealing with edge cases. And so it's not we have a crawler, but whatever. And then there's like companies like Backslash that are also, they're doing a little bit of cloud where they're analyzing, Backslash Security is analyzing the cloud configuration to understand the pathways. And then they'll run their static analysis and SCA components to try to find issues. And what I like about them is they focus on the toxic workflow. So they'll find, you can look on their dashboard and you see like 1,000 vulns they found or whatever. But they're going to say like, but these are the 20 that you should immediately care about. And like the recommendation engine, I think is really cool. One of the things I talked about in the series, the While AppSec Product Suck series, is the depth versus breadth, right? So you can do things, you're always going to have that trade-off, right? Are you doing a whole bunch of things, or are you doing like individual things very well, right? And I see that with the individual product category. So even in SCA, like, oh, they support this language, but did they just like quickly add support for the language and it's not very deep and it doesn't deal with all the frameworks of that language in depth? Well, now if you do that when you're a multi-category crossing product, your depth and breadth challenge is like multiplied, right? It's an n factorial multiplication that you're adding to yourself. So then I see companies like Arnica, who's kind of like monitoring the developers a little bit more. So they'll like add some of their own like SCA, static analysis and kind of dev trust monitoring kind of stuff that they'll do, monitor the GitHub check-ins. And Oxeye actually is probably the big example of having all of the categories. They're like DAS, SAST, SBOM, SCA, all in one. I'm like, okay, that's a lot to take on. Like, I spent a career on one category. Now you're like doing all of them. So it's interesting. But I do think, going to your question, is does the categories make sense? I think they make sense to understand kind of what each of these products do. But as an individual product, I don't think you can do just SAST and be very successful anymore. I don't think you can do just SCA and actually be as successful anymore. I'm sorry, SAST, right? You couldn't do just SAST alone, because if you're doing just SAST alone, the way people build now, you have so many black holes, right? Like there's a library they pick on and they include into their code, and they're not going to have visibility into all of it. You don't have all the code anymore. When you're looking at your own repo, the way DevOps builds the code, you don't have it all at once the same way we did, back in the day.
And it sounds like that, yeah, that theme is architectures have changed, as well as hopefully, and here I might be projecting some of my desires onto you, but hopefully some of the security, like you can't just have SAST, because the tools actually need to refocus on solving the problems that developers need solved, or the problems that they have. No developer ever wakes up in the morning and says, I wish my IDE had SAST in it. It's more like, I wish I had that little red squiggle that was helping me, not make a mistake or pointing something out, or helping me, do a search for in place or a quick refactor if I want to rename a function. But I want to switch here, maybe a little bit of a segue to, talk maybe a little bit about that, about solving the developer problems that you've seen, as well as the leadership aspect of what it sounds like you're trying to do is talk to development teams, talk to startups about influencing how those products should be solving, or even just identifying their problems correctly, rather than saying, yep, we tick the SAST box, the DAS box, the SCA, the IAST, and I'm going to mumble all the rest of the acronyms that we could have.
For a long time, even when we're doing DAS, like people are like, well, how do I solve this, right? How do I solve these problems that are showing up at the DAS? So like DAS is kind of the last step, right? And so if you work your way backwards, people will be like, shifting left, or it's like going to static analysis. Well, before that, it's the developer. So then I was like, oh, it needs to be dev training, right? Like developers need to be trained and to have awareness of the security implications of what they're doing, right? And so I kind of spent a little bit of time down that rabbit hole, and then what I found, and I kind of saw in our own experience, is that the dev leadership was also a foundational problem, because what's happening is the developers tend to be, if you think about how people dev now, and it's all sprints, right? We used to have the big old waterfall models, which had their massive flaws. But the release early, release often that I saw with Linux was amazing. And then that became like sprint models and Kanban and all this stuff. And so you're having these very sliced bits of work. And while that gives us on the business side a lot of predictability into kind of the movement and kind of building out roadmaps and things like that, what I saw is that there's a lot of like, you could find a lot of content and learnings around like leadership, right? So there's like generic leadership talks and conferences and all these kind of things. And then you can also go online and learn a lot about product management, right? And like how to build out your workflows and how to be a good scrum master and all these kind of things. But what you end up with is a lot of developers that are working in these narrow moments of time of work. And there's not an overarching leadership conversation that's saying, okay, here's where we are now, and here's where we're going, and here's where we're going to be in like 2 years, right? Of course, things can change, but here's kind of where we want to be. And then have the conversations on like, how would I get to that destination in a sane manner, right? It's kind of like when you're building Legos, right? You see the whole picture before you start building, right? And then you have the instructions that take you piece by piece, but you kind of always know your end destination to a large extent, right? And so there's that ongoing picture of it. But imagine if you just were focused on this, and then you had developers each take a page and go off and build their own little piece, and then you actually try to assemble it, you're going to have problems, right? Things aren't going to actually assemble properly together.
Now, but don't we have things like OKRs for that quarterly vision to bring people together and goals? How does, I'm trying to pull in our business speak here to see, does that make a difference for this? Or is this just, we give people a couple pages and say, you have to read 3 pages of this instruction manual by the end of the quarter?
So, and maybe, I've only been I can only talk to the OKRs that I've been part of. Quite frankly, most of them are business related, right? Here's where we want sales to be. Here's the major features, how we're going to integrate these 2 products or whatever. But it's not on an individual product basis. I don't see a lot of long-term vision casting and then having conversations around it and saying like, okay, here's where we want to go. Here's where we want to be. And then what's the security implications of these things, right? What's the access controls that we need to be building in now so we're not tacking them on later, and that's never going to, not retrofitting a year and a half from now. Let's have the conversation today.
And that's why one of the reasons I perked up when you started talking about this is that we just covered the CISAs updated their Secure by Design, and one of their major pillars of it, they had 3 things, was security leadership. And they were talking about accountability, responsibility. You're giving us, I think, possibly a nuanced, a different approach towards leadership that maybe they didn't exactly call out, but that I think appreciates what you were saying. Like, what if we have a long-term vision? What does that mean for access controls, the data that we're collecting? I'd be curious if you could maybe tell us a bit more, with some examples of some conversations you've had or how you've just approached that, rather than because I don't think you're standing up in the boardroom saying I have a vision and you're mandating this from on high and everybody's supposed to follow the cult of Dan for building this.
Yeah. So a lot of this was just born out of my own experience in leading teams and always casting a vision and then having a conversation around it. I actually saw Steve Jobs when he was working at Next. He had talked about this. He's like, I don't just try to tell everybody where we're going and like dictating. I like to say, here's what I think we're going. Let's all talk about how we get there, right? And And he's like, you know, I don't want to give orders and get people to like buy in. Like, let's all agree on how we're going to do this. Let's like have the long conversations sometimes that it takes. You got a whole bunch of smart engineers and you're just telling them to do things and not like engaging in the conversation. So I spend a lot of time focusing on the engaging of the conversation. So to your point, it's not about like dictating how exactly. I'm not like, you know, look at like what Gene Kim does, like when he like defined the Phoenix Project, and now he's got his new book coming out, which I've already pre-ordered. But I look at like what he'll do, and he's good at like documenting out a process, right? I'm just trying to have a conversation on like what's good leadership look like? How do you inspire a team around a problem and then work with them on it? So, you know, I have another Mike that was on my team. And I would love to sit down with him and like we'd talk about what we're going to do. And then I would say, okay, how would you build this? How would we do this? And then he would come up with a model. And then this is another thing. I'd see a lot of product managers or project managers. They're afraid to get into the technical conversations with the engineer, right? Because they know the engineer is going to take them down a hole that's way too deep for them, right? And Mike was a dramatically better engineer than I'll ever be. I'm a decent software developer, right? And I'm a decent architect, but not like some of the guys on the team. And so I would like sit there and have the conversation, kind of like you do with interviews, right? Like, explain to me how you're doing this. And then why did you choose that? Like, why do you have a switch instead of a bunch of if else's here or whatever, right? Like, explain to me how this is working. And it's non-confrontational. You're not like judging. You're just trying to learn. And I cannot even count how many times in those conversations, Mike or one of the other guys on the team was like, oh, wait a minute. Actually, if I do it this way instead, that's probably going to end up working out better, and that would actually scale, or that would do, you know, that would leave us open to solving the next problem. And then he would go like, I gotta go work on this, right? But just, you know, and some of the stuff I understood, some of it was beyond me, quite frankly. But in letting them work through their process, and when you force somebody to explain their work a little bit, often they'll you know, I'm sure everybody's had that experience, right? Just like explaining to your kid, you know, how this works. Like, oh, I got to remember how this even happens. Right?
What was calculus?
And engaging in those conversations.
But no, what I think you've hit there is that idea of, and I'll maybe pull in a little bit of the concepts of good documentation, but in the sense of to explain something briefly, to be concise, you have to understand it really well. And I think that's what you just described to us. Mike just thinking like, oh, you know what? I was describing how it works, but it could work even better. And I like that phrasing too of the help me learn, or, you know, how does this, or the asking why. I often use this as a help me understand. Sometimes I leave the unspoken, help me understand this ridiculous architecture that doesn't make any sense and I think is doomed to fail, supposed to work. But sometimes it is, help me understand how we're going to prioritize, you know, these two things over the next month so that we can have, you know, the MVP, or we can have, you know, some access controls, or we can actually not even collect data. So we don't even need a burden of certain access controls.
Yeah. And when you're doing that, if you're leading and you understand the long term of where you want to get, right, where you want to be in 2 years, sometimes you'll pick up on the things they're doing that's a short-term solution that could engineer yourself into a corner, right? It was like, well, remember, we want to go here eventually, right? Like, oh, that's right. I wasn't thinking about that. I'm just trying to solve this narrow problem, going back to the sprint, right? I'm trying to solve this one narrow problem. And it's like, well, but that's gonna have to be all rewritten because this is where we're going. And so a little tweak now can get us from going too far off path, right?
And some of the things, like, you're not exactly describing threat models, because you're describing more of what should we be building rather than what are we building and what could go wrong. And the reason I'm bringing that up is I'm curious, you know, you mentioned there weren't many resources, and thinking back to, you know, the conferences I've seen, there was a lot of, you know, the leadership styles of Sun Tzu was popular for a while. Then everybody wanted to do Clausewitz. Attila the Hun got mentioned every once in a while, but, nobody really modern and nobody outside those cliches. I'm curious, did you find good resources for doing this type of leadership, development leadership, especially with that security angle that you were touching on?
I haven't, which is why I started the channel. I started the Dan on Dev podcast or YouTube channel. Largely just start having the conversation. My first episodes were the why all AppSec products suck, because I had that content for conference talks, and so I split it up and then expanded a little bit, and then also brought in some guests to have a good conversation. And now I've kind of pivoted over to actually the dev leadership conversation that I really want to be having and continuing. And so that's kind of where the channel is going to be focused is on this, because I'm not seeing a lot of content in this area that helps people. Because again, yes, for me as a security guy, it goes back to the security conversation. I see everybody's pumping their data into data lakes. Wait, how are we tagging this data so that we can apply access controls and not just shoving it into the data lake, right? And everyone wants to go data lakes, and then they go ML, machine learning, and then AI, and I'm where's the controls on this stuff? How do we pick things back up? Even I think, some of this whiteboard here, I've got a VR startup that I've got going, and it's data and analytics for VR content, and from the get-go, conversation is very in depth on how we're going to handle authentication, how we're going to, are we going to actually copy data? So we have, in our case, we have, and this is a good example, right? In our example, we have the enterprise customer, we have the content creator, and then we have an end user, right? So there's 3 people, and then us. We want some of the data for our own industry reports, right? Kind of think like a white hat sec when they would put out their annual reports, kind of thing, right? The enterprise customer should have access to all the data. End user won't have much of it at all. The enterprise customer will have all of the data. Content creator will have some of the data. Maybe the enterprise customer will also share their data with them, and then us. And so it's okay, do we put it in and then have data masks over things? But that could mean if our mask doesn't cover the right things, data might leak out. Or do we copy the very specific things and now have duplicate data? But I want to have this conversation now while we're just getting going, so that we lock in the models and then we can publicize it. Because I want everybody to know what our models are going to be and what they can depend on, right? And make it explicit from the start, because I know I'm going to be leading this for the next couple of years, right? And so I want to have it all built out now, have the conversations up front, and then we can build, and everybody knows the rules, right? All the way through. I see most people going oh, these are the features. I want this widget on this screen, and this is the, this.
Let's argue about the color rather than the
security.
Than the framework. And you're touching on transparency there too, which I just want to call out. That was one of the aspects of that CISA, security by design. So it's nice to see. It's nice to see an example of what that might look like in the real world, rather than just off of a PDF. But I don't know, John, if you look like you had a question coming up here.
Yeah,
I wanted to bring you in here.
Dig back in. I'm going to combine something you just said there, Dan, with around that amount of planning, and going back to why all AppSec tools suck. I'm curious on this also, since you're you're sort of in the midst of startup brain too. So this hopefully is going to be interesting. I know we're short on time. So from my experience, most AppSec startups don't do that. Let's plan out the next 5 years, right? It's we want to make a scanner or either a DAST or a SAST or something that's going to do pull requests or something real small, little tiny thing. When that's brought out to customers, the customers are this is really great, but I'm also looking for this too. And the next thing you know, as I referred to, you've got an extra arm hanging off the body, or an extra few fingers going in different directions, and now you've got a modern AppSec product. So back to the previous conversation around why AppSec sucks, and these things, which is you were talking about, let's add on a scanner. It's not just something you add on. How would you either, towards the startup view of how do they manage that to a customer's expectations, or from a customer's point of view of this would be great if you added this one thing, how do we deal with that sort of noise which goes back and forth?
Man, we've dealt with that so many times. It's a combination of things, and this is again where some good leadership is it says, okay, is this thing that they're asking for does that make sense to be part of our long-term strategy? And if it does, let's design it in, right? If it doesn't, you got to learn to say no, right? Just like, and I know it's difficult. I mean, look, I ran a startup, and I know what it was like having we didn't really take any funding on any significant amount of funding. So we were paying the bills by invoices that came in, right? And so chasing those dollars.
Sweet money, just have this one real quick feature.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's survival. It's not about like, wealth and riches. It was about absolute survival and keeping the electricity on. But you still have to know when to say no, because it doesn't make sense long term. And what you're going to end up with is a customer that then depends on that feature, and you're stuck supporting it in this weird, funky, as you said, arm attached to the to the back or whatever, finger sticking out of your forehead. All that kind of stuff is going to happen. It's good Halloween, imagery there. But that's all going to happen if you don't understand how to say no, and you don't have a long-term vision, right? If there's no long-term vision and you're just in like constant pivot mode, you're going to end up with a funky product, right?
Follow up on that. So then you blame the vendor for that, not the customer?
Yeah, I mean, the customer's going to ask what the customer's going to ask for, But I would, as a customer, if I knew they were building it just for me, I would be very suspicious of how long I can depend on that thing. Okay. We had customers. We had one of the bigger software companies in the world as a customer, and we were very specific about things we were building for them. And we had like built out this whole model. We had they had story points. They had actually control over dev time in a sense. But I could still veto things, right? Like if it didn't make sense. And I would be very explicit if I'm like, okay, I'm building this for you. No other customer is asking me for this thing. So any support is going to come off of your budget, right? Going forward on these things. And sometimes they'd be like, maybe we'll find somebody else to do that, right? But I had to be very explicit on, any fixes, any bugs, all that is going to be on your guys' budget, not mine, or we're going to kill the thing. And even then, I would try to make sure we went back and figured out the right place to integrate it, right? Like, okay, maybe we'll have a hand with 6 fingers, but at least the finger's not on the forehead, right? And we try to figure that out.
Thank you for the wonderful metaphors. I'm curious there too, is one of the things, you used, I am always actually leery of metaphors, except for anything mutant related. But, the Lego box, for example, sure, there's a picture, but if that's for 3 or 5 years, sometimes that picture should in fact change because applications change. There's a new technology that comes in. So I'm curious, how do you also have the leadership skills or the presence of mind to figure out, well, we are going to either, to John's point, kind of let the customer perhaps steer us a bit, or the industry, or something that's forward looking that we know that, well, I'm going to pick on PHP a little bit. Maybe PHP isn't going to be like the major programming language of the future. We're going to support something else, from those tactical and strategic types of decisions.
So I guess, again, planning helps. As we, let's go to just building our DAST. The crawling is a discovery piece, right? And so we were very clear about like building this discovery component, which we call the crawler, to go crawl a web page, go through and enumerate all the pages and find all the inputs. And then there was a clear line for where we would then like analyze it, handle deduplications, all that kind of stuff. And then the attacking engine was separated, and even even the data formats were kind of separated, but we componentized things. So like when single page apps started coming out and we needed to rethink our crawler, it was one discovery piece that had to be replaced out. And we could go build a team that could go build a new one. And we already had well-defined APIs between layers. And so they could go build that, because I knew that's a discovery piece that's going to continue to evolve. And so if you plan things out and you kind of look at like, well, what happens if our world changes over here? Well, how do we componentize and separate these things, right? If you're just building all one big monolith, you really get yourself in some trouble, right? And I think that is usually what happens when you're just kind of developing without a plan. is you're just kind of like, you got this one big thing and just keep tacking things on, as opposed to strategically looking at what are these components, how do we isolate and separate them so they can have, we see this with like microservice applications now. It's like a whole bunch of little microservices doing their bits. That's kind of an extreme where we're headed. But I think those kind of help because you can replace out individual components without destroying your whole product.
And I was curious because you described that with the discovery, like that's an abstraction layer. And even going back a little bit to your data lake, I'm curious, like perhaps that abstraction layer is our approach tenant isolation, where it's just pure silos of data? Is it the RBAC? Is it in fact like application layer encryption, where we distribute keys, which all have different engineering challenges to them and purity of solutions? But I think we've set aside, and I love that nobody has said like this is the 100% secure. This is all risk and design and engineering. And I just want to emphasize that's how you're approaching that. I also want to bring up the idea that talking about our friend Mike, that was a very senior architect, very informative, informed guy, better engineer than I was too, I will admit as well. And I even liked C++. But what about the junior developers? What do those conversations look like for new developers who might just be, well, I learned the bubble sort in my CS class, and I took security as an elective, so I know what the OWASP top 10 is. I can counter some cross-site scripting in SSRF. What did you want me to talk about?
Yeah, so everybody is different, and that's another thing is they're not like just man hours, right? You have to look at each of these, and actually one of the videos I already posted is like, I like to look at these folks. I like to look at engineers. Most of the time when you talk about creatives, right? If you're like just like in general speak, you think of the painter, the musician, right? Those are the creatives. I like to look at my engineers as creatives because to me, they are actually creating things that are like they're like, they're building something out of nothing. They can literally take a blank screen and create a machine that's going to repeat its job over and over again, which I think is awesome. And as an engineer myself, and watching engineers over the years, everybody's got their own different style, and some of it can be maddening at times because they're like, why do you name things this way or whatever it is, right? But you get a lot of that. And so even with the juniors, I like to get their perspective on like how are they coming into this problem, and then inspire them around where we're going. Again, having that vision and sharing it to them, because then they'll know how to develop their own skill set to reach that vision with us, right? And so if they understand, there's been so many times, I had this guy Connor, loved when he joined our team, and he ended up being phenomenal. But what was cool about him in the beginning is he was super excited, right? And our team at that point was a lot of old dogs, right? Mike and Dimitri and Arm, like we all had been around together for a long time, grizzled old vets, and you get these young guys coming in, and the energy was fun. It was like the puppy now joining in with the group, and they love to learn. And so if you get good young junior engineers that are excited, I got Gijo on this over here. He's fantastic. He loved talking with the guys. Again, young pup that was coming in excited. And I would get these folks in and let them attach to somebody, trying to find somebody that was a personality match on the senior team that would mentor them and be patient with them and just remind them like, hey, remember, this was you, right? 10, 15 years ago, whatever. And then bring them along, and not just like give them a job. Yes, you give them a task, give them something they can actually work on, but help them understand how this is this one little piece of this greater sum and where we're going. And I think when you always know where you're headed, right, then it's kind of like an army general, like, hey, we're going to take that hill, but I need you to go take out that bunker so that this guy can get over here. So like if they kind of understand the path a little bit. Right? Not just give them orders, but share with them a little bit about how we're going to get there and how your piece is going to help get there. I think they get more excited, and they'll put in the effort to learn and catch up.
See, I knew we couldn't avoid a Clausewitz or bringing some military into this. But I love this conversation. Want to continue. We are running low on our own time here. How are you, as a leader, how are you also, maybe a final topic here, would you talk to someone else who wants to provide that leadership as well?
I think a lot of it is, one, being a better listener, right? I don't know how many times the better idea came from somebody else on the team, junior or senior or whatever. Watching for the good ideas and then becoming a champion for those ideas, right? Connor may have had a fantastic idea. Junior guy, like, that's great. I'm going to now bring that into the plan and champion it. Now they're excited because their thing became part of the plan, right? Their little idea. It's like that one guy you've seen the videos where, I'm sure some people seen the video where there was a reporter or something was asking Elon Musk questions about the rocket. And he's like, why don't you do this? And then the next time it was like completely out of nowhere, right? But he championed the idea, they fixed it and actually solved a problem, right? For SpaceX, right? So being a good listener, picking up on these things, like taking the time to listen and then adopt the best ideas. Get rid of the ego on where the ideas came from and take on the ego of your whole team to champion the good ideas, right? And so I think for me, that's been really key. Spending time listening to these as people as individuals and then picking up on the great ideas and going pushing them. And
I have to say, that also sounds like a more appealing place to work, too, rather than just be told, I'm a cog in the machine and I'll go implement what Dan says because he thinks this and this is his vision, and not having any chance to provide just a thought, even if it's not the best one that lands on the table. Being able to have that bi-directional conversation seems really important and appealing to inspire folks. Dan, I could continue to listen to you, but we are running out of time. But I do have one last request of you. We've been asking all of our guests this year to describe AppSec in 3 words. And now I'm really curious on your take on this, given your background now.
Yeah. Yeah, I was warned and I completely forgot to think this out a little bit. But I guess what is AppSec is let me think about this.
I mean, we can go with Dan on dev, but that doesn't feel as insightful as it should be.
Yeah. No, I think it's finding. I guess it's boring finding app problems, but it's finding gaps, finding the gaps, because there's always gaps in where you thought things were going to go, and that's where most of the devs most of the attackers find their entry, is finding the gaps.
I love it. And perhaps we can, if you find the gaps proactively, that's where some secure design can come from, as you're describing the data lake and other examples.
Yeah, if you do that in the planning, if you consider the gaps in the planning, and also I'll admit one last thing a bit is not everybody has the background I have to be able to have the conversation and spot where the engineers are having problems. But hopefully if you're having group conversations, your engineers will spot each other's mistakes a little bit, especially if it's an open conversation and it's not, a dictatorial situation where everybody's afraid.
Well, hopefully no one is afraid to go follow up on the Dan on Dev YouTube channel and hear more from you. So hopefully they'll do that. Anything else you want to pitch? Do you have any conferences coming up or new talks that you want to do?
No, I just did one. I was supposed to be at HUSECCon, which I ended up having a family emergency and had to skip out on. But I haven't set up anything coming up. Just the channel. I joined another cybersecurity company recently, and I've got so much stuff going on. It's bananas. But I guess the YouTube channel is going to probably be where I'll be doing most of my community conversation.
That's wonderful. Well, we had fun having a conversation with you here, and look forward to bringing you back on for some more too. See how some either more resources on leadership that you discover, or just more examples of also that secure by design in addition to as you're pushing on evolving security tools. So thank you so much, Dan.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for letting me join you guys.
Happy to have you here. Happy to have John as well, and all of our listeners. We're going to take a quick break and return with news of the week.